You don't realize it at first. It feels like nothing, just silence, just space. Just you finally stepping back after giving everything you had. No more over-explaining, no more chasing, no more trying to prove your worth to someone who kept pulling away every time things got real. You tell yourself you're done, you tell yourself you're choosing peace. But what you don't see, what you don't feel yet, is the shift that has already begun on the other side of that silence. Because your absence is not empty, it is not weak, it is not something that gets ignored. Your absence is loud, it echoes in places your presence never could. And for someone who is wired to run from closeness, your silence doesn't just create distance, it creates a confrontation they can no longer avoid. This is where everything changes. Not when you were trying harder, not when you were giving more, but the moment you stopped, the moment you disappeared emotionally. That's when your energy stopped feeding their comfort. And suddenly, they had to face what was left behind. And what's left behind is you, but in a way they've never experienced before. At first, it looks like they don't care. That's the part that breaks most people. You go silent, and they don't react. No message, no sign, no visible emotion. It feels like you meant nothing. It feels like all the memories, all the connection, all the effort just disappeared without impact. But what you're seeing is not the truth. It's the surface. It's the mask they've perfected over time. Because they don't process emotions the way you do. They don't react in the moment. They detach in the moment. They suppress. They distract. They convince themselves they're fine. And for a while, they actually believe it. They fill their time, they keep moving, they avoid thinking too deeply about what just changed. And from the outside, it looks like your absence meant nothing. But here's what's really happening underneath that calm exterior. Your absence has disrupted their pattern. You were part of a cycle. You reached out, they pulled away, you came back, they stayed comfortable. That cycle gave them control. That cycle gave them emotional safety. But now, the cycle is broken, and even if they don't show it immediately, something inside them starts noticing. Something feels off, something feels unfamiliar, and that unfamiliar feeling is where everything begins. There's a fear they never talk about, a fear they barely understand themselves. It's not just about losing someone, it's deeper than that. It's the fear of being seen too closely, the fear of losing control over their emotions, the fear that if they let someone in completely, they won't be able to protect themselves anymore, so they build distance, they create space, they convince themselves that independence is safety. And when someone gets too close, when emotions start getting real, when connection starts turning into something deeper, they pull away. Not because they don't feel anything, but because they feel too much in a way they don't know how to handle. And this is why your presence sometimes felt like pressure to them, not because you were doing something wrong, but because your consistency, your care, your emotional openness, it challenged their defense system. It made them feel exposed. But now, your absence does something even more powerful. It removes the distraction. It removes the push and pull dynamic. It leaves them alone with something they've been avoiding for a long time, their own emotions. And when there's no one there to chase them, no one there to reassure them, no one there to fill the silence, that fear doesn't disappear. It transforms. It becomes curiosity. It becomes discomfort. It becomes a quiet realization that something important is no longer there. Chasing feels natural when you care. You want clarity, you want reassurance, you want to fix what feels broken. So you reach out, you try to understand, you try to bring things back to how they were. But every time you do that with someone who is wired to avoid emotional intensity, it has the opposite effect. Your effort doesn't pull them closer, it pushes them further away. Because what feels like love to you feels like pressure to them. Every message, every attempt to reconnect, every emotional expression, it adds weight to something they already struggle to carry. And their response is not to lean in, it's to create more distance. But the moment you stop chasing, something shifts, the pressure disappears, the expectations fade, and suddenly they are no longer reacting to your energy, they are left with their own. And that's when they start to feel the difference. Because when you were chasing, they didn't have to question anything. They didn't have to wonder if you'd still be there. But now, they don't know. Now there's uncertainty. Now there's a space where your presence used to be, and that space begins to speak louder than anything you ever said. When you stop giving, it feels like loss on your side. It feels like you're letting go of something meaningful. It feels like you're the one losing connection, losing closeness, losing the possibility of what could have been. But what you don't realize is that this is the exact moment where the power shifts. Not power in a manipulative way, but in an energetic way. Because before, you were investing more, you were showing up more, you were holding the emotional weight of the connection, and they were receiving it without fully understanding its value. But now, that flow is gone, that consistency is gone, that emotional availability is gone, and in its place, there is silence, there is space, there is absence. And that absence forces a realization they didn't have access to before. Because people don't always understand what they have when it's constantly available, but they feel it deeply when it's no longer there. And this is where attraction begins to rebuild in a completely different way. Not from chasing, not from proving, but from the mystery of your silence, from the strength of your detachment, from the quiet message that you are no longer waiting, no longer reaching, no longer trying to force something that wasn't being met halfway. And that message, without a single word, becomes impossible to ignore. And that message doesn't need words, because silence has a way of speaking directly to the parts of someone that noise never reaches. When you were explaining yourself, when you were trying to be understood, when you were pouring your emotions out hoping they would finally meet you halfway, they could avoid it. They could deflect, distract, or emotionally step back. But Silence removes all escape routes. It doesn't argue, it doesn't chase, it doesn't demand. It simply exists, and in that existence it creates space for something they've been avoiding for a long time. Feeling, real feeling, the kind they can't mute with logic or distance, because now there's no reassurance coming in, no messages to respond to, no emotional safety net, just the quiet absence of someone who used to be there. And that quiet becomes loud, louder than any conversation you ever had, louder than any explanation you ever gave. It lingers in their mind when they least expect it, in small moments, in pauses, in the spaces where your energy used to exist. And that's when it starts, the slow realization that something important is missing, not because you said it, but because they can finally feel it. This is where their mind begins to shift in ways you can't see. On the surface, they may still appear distant, still calm, still unaffected, but internally, something is changing. Because without your presence filling the gaps, their thoughts have more room to wander. And when they wander, they begin to revisit moments they once brushed off, conversations they didn't fully engage in, emotions they didn't fully process. Your absence creates a kind of mental replay they didn't choose, but can't stop. They start remembering the way you showed up, the way you cared, the consistency you brought into their life. And slowly, what once felt ordinary begins to feel rare. What once felt available begins to feel valuable. And the more they think, the more questions begin to surface. Why did you stop reaching out? Why does it feel different now? Why does the silence feel heavier than expected? These are questions they didn't have to ask before, because your presence answered everything for them. But now, they are left searching for answers in a space that no longer responds. And that search begins to pull them deeper into something unfamiliar. Awareness. Avoidance works best when emotions are fresh and immediate. In the moment, they can disconnect, they can shut down, they can convince themselves they don't need anything deeper. But time and absence have a different effect, because emotions that are suppressed don't disappear, they wait. And when the noise of interaction is gone, they start to rise, slowly, quietly, but powerfully. What they once pushed away begins to resurface in unexpected ways, a memory that suddenly feels heavier, a moment that suddenly carries more meaning, a feeling they didn't allow themselves to experience, now showing up without warning. And this is the part no one talks about, the part where their emotional walls begin to crack, not because someone forced them to, but because there's no longer anything holding those walls up. Your absence removes the external focus. It turns their attention spin inward, and when that happens, they are left with everything they tried not to feel when you were there. The connection, the closeness, the impact you had on their life. And now, without distraction, it becomes real. Not overwhelming all at once, but enough to create a shift they can't ignore anymore. This is where value is finally felt, not intellectually but emotionally. Because when something is always available, it becomes part of the background. It becomes expected. It becomes something they assume will always be there, no matter how they show up. But when that same thing disappears, it no longer feels ordinary, it feels significant, it feels rare, it feels like something they may not get back. And that realization doesn't come from what you said, it comes from what they no longer have access to. Your energy, your attention, your consistency, all the things they once experienced without fully appreciating now become the very things they start missing. And missing something isn't just about absence, it's about contrast. The contrast between what was and what is now. The difference between having you there and feeling your absence in moments where they least expected it to matter. And that's when they begin to understand something they couldn't see before. Your presence wasn't just filling space in their life, it was adding something meaningful, something grounding, something real. And now that it's gone, the space feels different, not empty, but incomplete. But even as this realization begins to grow, there is still a battle happening inside them, a quiet conflict between what they feel and what they're used to doing. Because reaching out means vulnerability. It means stepping into a space they've spent so long avoiding. It means risking the loss of control they've always tried to maintain. And for someone who is used to protecting themselves through distance, that's not an easy step to take. So they hesitate, they go back and forth. One moment they feel the urge to reconnect, the next moment they pull themselves back into silence. Their ego tells them to stay in control, to not give in, to not show too much. But their emotions, slowly, begin to say something different. And that tension creates a kind of internal pressure, because now they're not just avoiding you, they're avoiding what they feel. And the longer your absence continues, the harder that becomes. Because your silence is no longer just space. It's a mirror, a reflection of what they didn't give, what they didn't express, what they didn't fully appreciate when they had the chance. And that reflection doesn't fade, it stays, it lingers, and eventually it leads them to a point where they have to decide, stay in the comfort of distance or take a step towards something real. And that decision is where everything either comes back together or finally falls apart for good. Because not everyone returns. That's the truth most people don't want to hear. Absence is powerful, but it's not a guarantee. It doesn't magically change someone into a different person overnight. What it does is reveal. It reveals what was real, what was surface level, and what someone is actually capable of facing within themselves. When they do come back, it's not random. It's because the silence became too loud to ignore. It's because the emotional weight of losing you finally outweighed the fear of getting close. It's because something inside them shifted enough to make them step out of their comfort zone. But when they don't come back, it's not because your absence had no impact. It's because their fear is still stronger than their feelings. It's because facing vulnerability still feels more dangerous than losing connection. And that's not something you can fix. That's not something you can chase into changing. Because the truth is, your absence doesn't create their capacity, it exposes it. It shows you whether they are able to meet you in a deeper space, or if they are still trapped in the same patterns that pushed you away in the first place. And that clarity, even when it hurts, is power. But here's where most people lose that power the moment things start to shift. The moment a message comes in, the moment they feel that pull again, the moment hope starts to rise. After everything you went through, after finally pulling back, after finally choosing yourself, it takes just one moment of emotional reaction to reset everything. Responding too quickly, giving too much too soon, slipping back into the same energy of over-explaining, over-giving, over-trying. It feels natural because that's who you were in the dynamic. But the moment you fall back into that pattern, the dynamic resets. the mystery disappears, the emotional weight of your absence fades, and they slip right back into the comfort they had before, where they didn't have to fully show up. This is the hardest part, not the silence, not the distance, but maintaining your self-worth when the door opens again. Because now it's not about getting them back, it's about not losing yourself again in the process. It's about remembering why you stepped away in the first place, and choosing not to abandon that version of yourself just because they decided to reappear. Because the real power was never in making them come back. The real power was in who you became when you stopped chasing, when you stopped trying to force something that wasn't being given freely, when you stopped attaching your worth to their attention. That version of you, the one who can sit in silence without breaking, the one who can walk away without needing closure, the one who can hold space for their emotions without losing control of your own. That is the energy that changes everything. And it's not about pretending not to care. It's not about playing games or acting distant to manipulate an outcome. It's about genuinely reaching a place where your peace matters more than their inconsistency, where your self-respect matters more than temporary connection, where your emotional independence becomes stronger than your desire for validation. And that energy, that grounded, calm, detached presence, is something they can feel, even without communication, even without interaction, because it shifts how you exist, not just in their life, but in your own. And here's something most people misunderstand. Your absence doesn't just create attraction. It also creates a feeling they're not used to dealing with, rejection. Even if they were the one pulling away, even if they were the one creating distance, your silence flips the experience, because now they're the one who doesn't know where they stand. They're the one who doesn't have access to you the way they used to. And that unfamiliar position can trigger something deeper than they expect, because underneath the avoidance, underneath the need for control, there is still a human fear of being left, of being replaced, of no longer mattering in someone's life. And your absence taps into that, not in a cruel way, but in a real way. It makes them feel what you felt when they were distant. It reflects their own behavior back to them, but now they are the one experiencing it from the other side. And that shift in perspective can either open something inside them or make them retreat even further. But either way, it reveals something important. It shows you how they respond when the roles are reversed. It shows you whether they are capable of stepping into your experience or if they remain locked in their own patterns. And this is where everything comes full circle, because your silence, your absence, it was never just about them. It was never just about triggering a reaction or creating a response. It was about you returning to yourself. It was about you breaking a cycle that kept you stuck in a space where you were giving more than you were receiving. It was about you choosing clarity over confusion, peace over anxiety, self-respect over emotional exhaustion. And whether they come back or not, whether they reach out or stay silent, the truth remains the same. You didn't lose anything by stepping away. You revealed everything. You saw the dynamic for what it was. You saw their capacity for what it is. And most importantly, you saw your own strength in a way you hadn't before. Because walking away, staying silent, holding your ground, that's not weakness. That's not giving up. That's growth. That's power. That's you no longer settling for something that couldn't meet you where you truly deserve to be. And in that space, whether they realize your value or not, you already have. And once you truly see your own value, something changes in a way that can't be reversed. Because now, even if they come back, even if they say the right things, even if they finally show a version of themselves you were waiting for, you're no longer the same person who once accepted less. You begin to observe instead of react. You begin to feel without immediately giving everything away. And that shift creates something powerful, a quiet distance that isn't forced but natural. And from that distance, something unexpected begins to happen on their side. Curiosity. Not the surface-level kind, but the kind that keeps them thinking about you when they don't want to. The kind that makes them wonder what changed, why you feel different, why they can't read you the same way anymore. Because before, you were predictable. You cared openly. You showed up consistently. They always knew where you stood. But now, there's mystery. Now there's space they can't access, and that space pulls them in. It makes them pay attention in a way they didn't before. And slowly, curiosity starts turning into something deeper, something more intense. Because when someone can no longer figure you out, they start trying harder than they ever did when you were fully available. And that intensity, it builds quietly at first. They might check your presence in subtle ways, wonder what you're doing, who you're talking to, whether you've moved on. They may not reach out immediately, but mentally, they're getting pulled back into your energy. Because now, instead of you chasing them, they are the ones thinking about you without control. And the more they think, the more they feel that pull, not just attraction, but something closer to urgency. Because now there's a possibility they didn't consider before, losing you completely. And that possibility creates pressure, a different kind of pressure than what they felt when you were chasing. This one comes from within. It's not about escaping anymore. It's about deciding, acting, doing something before it's too late. And this is where their resistance begins to weaken. Because avoiding something is easy when it feels optional, but when it starts to feel like a real loss, when it feels like something is slipping away for good, that's when avoidance becomes harder to maintain. That's when emotions begin to override patterns. And eventually, for some, that pressure reaches a breaking point, a moment where the silence becomes heavier than their fear of reaching out, a moment where they stop overthinking and just act. It might not come in the perfect way. It might not be some deep emotional confession. Sometimes it's simple, a message, a check-in, a small attempt to reconnect. But behind that small action, there's a lot happening. Because for them, even that step requires pushing against everything they're used to doing. And when that moment comes, it can feel overwhelming on your side too. Because this is what you once wanted. This is what you waited for. But now, you're in a different place. Now you have clarity. Now you have boundaries. Now you have a deeper understanding of what this connection really is and what it isn't. And this is where your response matters more than ever. Not just what you say, but the energy you bring into that moment. Because this is no longer about proving anything. It's about protecting everything you've built within yourself during the silence. So when they come back, the question isn't, how do I keep them? The question becomes, does this align with who I am now? Because if nothing has truly changed, if the patterns are still there, if the effort is still one-sided, then going back means stepping into the same cycle you worked so hard to break. And that's where many people get pulled back in, not because things are better, but because the feeling is familiar. And familiarity can feel like comfort, even when it's unhealthy. But this time, you have awareness. You can see the difference between real effort and temporary emotion, between genuine change and momentary loneliness. And that awareness gives you something you didn't have before: choice. The choice to engage differently, the choice to slow things down, the choice to not give everything away just because they showed up again. Because now, your energy is not something that's freely given to someone who hasn't proven they can hold it. Now, it's something that's protected, valued, respected, first by you. And in the end, this is the truth most people overlook. Your absence was never about making someone else realize your worth. It was about you realizing it first, because once you truly understand your value, everything else becomes secondary. Whether they come back or not, whether they change or stay the same, it no longer defines you. You are no longer waiting, no longer hoping, no longer attaching your peace to someone else's ability to show up. And that is the real transformation. Because the moment you stop chasing, stop proving, stop trying to be enough for someone who couldn't meet you halfway, you become something different, something grounded, something calm, something unshakable. And from that place, your absence is no longer a strategy, it's a standard, a reflection of the fact that you are no longer available for anything that doesn't match your level of depth, your level of presence, your level of truth. And that's why your absence is no joke, not because it forces someone else to act, but because it proves that you finally did. And even after all of this, there's one final shift that most people don't talk about. It's the moment where you stop watching them completely. Not out of anger, not out of pain, but out of genuine detachment. Because in the beginning, even your silence had a hidden expectation, a quiet hope that they would notice, that they would feel it, that they would come back. But now, that expectation fades. You're no longer checking, no longer wondering, no longer waiting for a sign. Your focus returns fully to your own life, your own growth, your own peace. And this is where your energy becomes untouchable, because it's no longer tied to an outcome. It's no longer reacting to what they do or don't do. It simply exists, grounded, calm, and self-contained. And ironically, this is often when they feel you the most. Not because you're trying to be distant, but because you've truly let go. There's no emotional pull from your side anymore, no invisible attachment keeping the connection alive, and that absence, that complete release, creates a different kind of impact, one that doesn't come from effort, but from truth. Because now, you're not just physically absent, you're energetically unavailable, and that is something they can't control, can't predict, and can't easily replace. So if there's one thing to understand through all of this, it's that your absence was never meant to be temporary. It was never meant to be a tactic you use just to bring someone back into your life. It was meant to be a turning point, a line you draw within yourself that says, I no longer abandon myself to keep someone else, because that's what was happening before. Every time you chased, every time you overgave, every time you ignored your own needs just to maintain the connection, you were leaving yourself behind. And now, you don't do that anymore. Now, your presence is a privilege, your energy is intentional, your love is no longer something that gets poured into someone who doesn't know how to hold it. And that changes everything, because whether they come back or not, you've already moved into a space where you win either way. If they return and meet you with real effort, you meet them from a place of strength. And if they don't, you continue forward without losing yourself again. And that's the real message behind all of this. Your absence was never the loss. It was the awakening, the moment you stopped being available for half-hearted connection and started becoming fully available for your own life.